The Roaring Twenties. What a time to be alive, right? The Jazz Age. The Harlem Renaissance was all the rage, with its poetry, music, and art influences. The Prohibition. Now that caused a rage of people bootlegging and smuggling alcohol from across the waters. Flappers were all bedazzled in their star-studded dresses, kicking up their heels to a syncopated beat, whether in the jazz clubs or out on the streets. Now, the stock market was also booming, and there was a land boom from 1920 to 1930 in America that was fueled by consumerism. This was from car sales and the promise of travel far and wide. Now, Henry Ford's Model T changed the standard of living. Businessmen now, from assembly lines, were getting paid time off. Veterans post-World War I were enfranchised and incentivized to spend their money. Americans during this time had resources to develop things like resorts and buy and sell land at inflated prices. Now, the promise of success and good old down south living was a dream sold and capitalized on at astronomical rates, especially in Florida. However, Florida had another history, one that was actually very unattractive, very unpleasant, just demoralizing, detrimental ultimately to the African Americans in that time. Quick disclaimer, guys, this video is going to tackle some very challenging and traumatic events. Viewer discretion is advised, especially if you're showing this to your children. Hello, love. I'm Marissa Harris, Southern Belle, creative, artist, historian, and time traveler. Welcome to Southern Belle Tales, where we tell tales of Black history so current and future generations can learn American history that may not be taught in their school books. I want my future children and your children to be engaged by these stories and empowered to continue sharing these stories in perfect divine timing. And because I'm an actress, I am going to throw in a little personalized twist. I mean, you know, do my thing. Have you ever heard of the Rosewood Massacre? Now, I certainly didn't learn about this in school. Thus, I'm learning alongside you. So buckle up, Buttercup. We're taking a ride through time. On January 1st, 1923 in Sumner, Florida, which was 7 miles east of Cedar Key, just off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, Fannie Taylor, a young white married woman, was stunned by the presence of her laundress. Sarah Carrier from Rosewood, Florida, just under 3 miles east of Sumner, and Sarah's granddaughter, Philomena Goins, had just arrived when Fannie had just been assaulted in her own home. Her husband, James Taylor, was away at work at this time. Now, so who did she say the assailant was? Now, don't worry, I'll tell you, but as this is a tale as old as time, yes, you're right. Now, we'll dive into specifics, but first, I want you to imagine the most rural, most agriculturally sound town you know. What are the people like? What's the essence of the environment? How is the economy of this place? I wonder if it was anything like Rosewood, Florida in the early 1920s. Now, let's go back to the 1800s for a bit. Now, roughly 100 years prior, in 1821, Florida became a U.S. territory, and Andrew Jackson was its governor. Yeah, the guy on the $20 bill, the segregationist who later became the 7th president of the United States. You know, we can talk about him at another time. But in case you are interested, go ahead and just look up the Seminole Wars from 1816 to 1858. Now, by 1845, Florida was mostly a slave state with almost half of its population enslaved. The statehood of the Iowa plus Florida Act continued the expansion of the plantation system. Established as a settlement in 1847, Rosewood was a relatively thriving, modest, predominantly African-American community. Now, within this part of the county of Levy, there were 3 churches and plenty of trees available to construct buildings and produce the fruits of their labor. A railroad for trade and commerce was snuggled in the middle of the forest, and it helped to boost the economy. Now, based on several sources, I found that between 100 to 300 foundational Black Americans were living life on the homestead. They were surrounded by vegetable gardens and orange trees. Some actually owned their own land and their own homes and contributed to their community by working at the local pencil mill, post office, or nearby turpentine mill. They were teachers, agriculturalists, and carpenters. They had families, faith, and their lives had value, as average as their purposes to some may have seemed. On January 1st, 1923, valuable resident Sarah Carrier, a 51-year-old laundress, worked 3 miles southwest of her employer, the Taylors, in Sumner, Florida, with her 11-year-old granddaughter, Philomena Goins. Now, Sumner was a predominantly white town just southwest of Rosewood. Now, in the wee hours of the morning, Frances Fanny Taylor, the young white married wife of James Taylor, a foreman at the local mill, was home when her husband was off at work, diligently working. Now, upon entering the Taylor home, Sarah saw Fanny disheveled and visibly upset with bruising on her body. Now, the back door was thrust open with the mysterious character quickly gone with the wind. Sarah was in a state of confusion and shock as she was at the precipice of understanding the implications of what she had just witnessed. Fanny, in all of her hysteria, exclaimed that the perpetrator was not her husband, nor any other white man, but a black man who just burst into her home, robbed her, assaulted her, for no reason at all. And you know, when her husband came home, she told him just that. Sarah watched as Fanny tried to convince her husband, James, of the story she told herself, of a black vigilante who came in like a thief in the night for no apparent reason at all. Now, a 1997 report in the Florida Historical Quarterly would later report that Sarah actually saw a white man inside the household leaving, not a black man. Devastated, Sarah watched on in horror as James telegraphed members of the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist far-right hate group in nearby Gainesville, to request their help. Now, according to Lizzie Robinson Jenkins, an 84-year-old descendant of the survivors of the massacre, somebody called the prison camp and requested dogs be sent to Sumner. Now, right around this time, a black fugitive named Jesse Hunter had just escaped from a prison chain gang. So, you know, you can only imagine the uproar that ensued based on these events merging in time. Thus, a white mob organized in Sumner before heading to Rosewood, where the fugitive was said to have fled. Now, simultaneously, the Levy County Sheriff, Robert Elias Walker, rallied a militia of men. These men had a propensity for violence and an affinity for hunting. So, Sheriff Walker sent out a message. I'd advise all blacks to continue working at the mills where you're at if you know what's good for you. Now, from what I understand, once laundry was complete at the Taylor residence, Sarah and Philomena traveled back to Rosewood. And God only knows the sense of urgency in their steps as they perceived that imminent danger. Now, allegedly, the white man who was at the Taylor house also traveled to Rosewood, just like the fugitive Jesse Hunter. And he stopped at the home of Aaron Carrier, a black man who worked as a cross-tie cutter, according to Lizzie Jenkins, who is also Aaron Carrier's niece. Now, for further context, Aaron was the nephew of Sarah Carrier. You still following me? Okay, good. Let's keep going. Now, this man knew that Aaron was a Mason and therefore gave him a Masonic knock, which then prompted Aaron to jump out of bed. Now, when Aaron opened up the door, he saw a white face and panicked. Child, now, you know. Now, while Masonic lodges were segregated at this time, Aaron reportedly honored their shared fraternity. Aaron did what any good neighbor would have done. He went to his neighbor, a black man named Sam Carter. Now, Sam had a wagon, and so he agreed to help the white man to escape to his hometown of Gulf Hammock. Now, all men were literally veterans, and it really showed. At this time, tensions were becoming more and more agitated. Multiple militias of men were out for blood. Armed with guns, with sniffing dogs in tow, they went on their hunt. As tracking dogs led Levy County Sheriff Walker's militia in the direction of Rosewood, a separate mob captured Aaron Carrier in Rosewood and questioned him about the fugitive, Jesse Hunter. Now, apparently, he knew nothing. I know nothing. But like I said, this was a hunt, and hunters like to catch their prey. Sheriff Walker's militia encountered the mob just as they were dragging Aaron behind a car towards Sumner. Now, Sheriff Walker, in what I deem was an apologetic act of decency, took Aaron into protective custody. Some sources say that Aaron was then transferred to Bronson County, located about 25 miles away to the city of Otter Creek. Now, some say Sheriff Walker drove him to Gainesville personally and asked the local sheriff to put him in jail for safekeeping for 6 months. Safekeeping. Right. Now, it was confirmed that Aaron did survive the massacre, though. And, you know, I bet his aunt was praying for his safety. Unfortunately, the rest of the tale of the Rosewood Massacre doesn't get any better. Later that evening, Sheriff Walker deputized citizens outside of his militia, who became an increasingly drunken and enraged mob. They caught Sam Carter, a hero, on his way back home after he transported the alleged white assailant to his hometown. Oral histories collected decades later would explain that Sam's courage to help this white man skip town is ultimately what led the dogs to Sam's home, specifically. Now, when Sam couldn't satisfactorily answer the questions about the alleged black fugitive and perceived assailant, a member of the mob shot him in the face. He was hanged, and not for committing a crime, but as a warning for African Americans in Rosewood. Now, Sam was a good man. He was doing what he thought was good, and it unfortunately just led to his demise. Now, at this time, Florida had the highest per capita lynching rate. And this is why the work of abolitionists like Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass and many more was so crucial to the survival of Black Americans during this time. And according to statistics by the Tuskegee Institute, after 1923, lynchings began to decrease, which is saying a lot considering the recorded lynchings we know of today. Day 2, January 2nd, 1923. Tensions were in the air, and uncertainty of the future was a devastating reality for the community of Rosewood. Sarah Carrier, 51, a laundress and grandmother, had a son named Sylvester. He was out encouraging members of the community to join their family at Sarah's home. He figured there would be safety in numbers should further violence erupt, and boy, did it erupt. The mob, mobilized, drunken, and deputized, approached the home of Sarah Carrier. Now, I learned from a St. Petersburg Times article from January 5th, 1923, that as many as 25 people, including children, were barricaded inside of Sarah's home on that second fateful day. Now, early in the evening, Sylvester, empowered with his gun, held off an attack on his mother's home when two men, Superintendent Henry Andrews of the Cummer Lumber Company's sawmill and Bolly Wilkerson of Sumner, started to enter Sarah's home without warning. Now, Sylvester fired off shots and mortally wounded them. Other bullets fired by Sylvester wounded 3 other white men. Let's just take a beat. You know what? Sylvester said he wasn't backing down without a fight. Okay, he literally protected his family. Now, that's my type of man. Just before dawn, the white men's ammunition ran out, and the residents of Rosewood knew what time it was. It was time to evacuate immediately. By the grace of God, many left before the supply could be replenished. You know what? One recurring thing I've noticed through my research is that when faced with adversity, our ancestors, many of them, put up a good fight. Honestly, though, whether they fought back or not, angry racists would make up any reason to shoot to kill. And their tyranny undoubtedly led to the Rosewood Massacre in 1923. Now, Sylvester's shots gave rise to the next events. The white racists were all like, these Negroes are on, we gotta put them back in their place. So shortly after midnight, members of the mob appealed to Sheriff Perry Gilbert Ramsey of Gainesville, roughly 50 miles northeast of Rosewood, to return to Rosewood with as many men as he could gather. Armed parties in Gainesville began to leave the city in droves in their vehicles. Remember the economical Ford Model T we were talking about at the beginning of this video? Yeah, they left in those. It was a 40-mile stretch through the backwoods of the country, headed in the direction of Rosewood. You know, with so much despair, how could the Black residents of Rosewood actually get to safety? The valuable residents of Rosewood, literally fearing for their life, sought refuge in an unlikely place. Ever since slavery was in effect, disenfranchised and enslaved peoples often had to seek support from unlikely characters to escape their environment in the hopes of someday becoming free. The unlikely character in this story was named John Wright, a white store owner in Rosewood. Now, he and his wife, Mary Jacobs Wright, played a major role in rescuing several terrified residents during the massacre. When I did my research on him, I got to read his story on findagrave.com. He actually enjoyed the patronage of Black people and often gave Black children free candy and cookies and befriended Black people in general. Now, he and his wife had no children of their own, and they occupied a 2-story home which was located on the northeast end of Rosewood, which was about a quarter mile from their store. He would become a base camp of refuge for the citizens of Rosewood in an unprecedented way. After Sylvester shot and killed those 2 men on January 2nd, by January 4th, a mob of up to, sources say, between 200 and 400 men carrying torches and guns returned to Rosewood. That day, Wright requested that Sylvester tell a man named John Bradley to get his 4 children and take them to John's home. Now, the Wrights then put the children to bed upstairs and told them not to make up. Now, sometime that same day, the Wrights left to attend the funeral of Polly Wilkerson. You remember him? One of the men that Sylvester had shot and killed. Imagine that. I don't know, it's the irony for me. Coincidentally, Sheriff Walker notified Wright to get the Black residents of Rosewood to meet at the John Wright house. Now, a train stopped near a depot, as his house, the John Wright house, was between the dirt highway and the railroad track. People in the Wright home escaped to safety by way of Gainesville and other places. Many of the residents had to flee to swamps and wooded forests, and were, by grace, also evacuated by train. Through the severe danger, which was literally life or death, some had to leave their homes with bare feet, or just the clothes on their backs, with no food. And it was really cold outside, as this was the dead of winter. The home they had grown to cherish was no more. They had nothing to return home to, but they did have their lives. However, many of the residents of Rosewood were not as fortunate. With guns and torches in hands, the now exponentially larger mob returned to Sarah's house. They shot Sarah, a pillar of the Rosewood community, point blank, and proceeded to rain bullets on her house before torching it to the ground. According to the St. Petersburg Times, a search of the house revealed that Sylvester had also been shot to death, although other sources say that he escaped the massacre. Now, this all occurred 102 years ago, so some sources just might be a little bit inaccurate upon cross-referencing. But regardless, this was the turning point in the history of Rosewood. Bullets rang out. People were running for their lives. Children were confused and scared. Adults were determined but mortified as the entire community went up in flames. The livestock, valuables and possessions, and land of the Black residents was ultimately robbed from them. But nothing was as precious as the lives that were taken that day. I would like to take this time to pay respects to a few of the valuable residents who we know for certain lost their lives during the 7-day massacre. Leslie Gordon, a Black widow who fled after the mob set her house on fire. She was literally running from her burning home when she was shot in the head. White racists traveling shot and killed a Black man named Mingo Williams in the jaw and left him for dead in the street just because, well, he was Black. Remember Aaron Carrier, whose Sheriff Walker placed in protective custody? Well, his father, James Carrier, an animal trapper, was returning home from his animal traps deep in the woods when a mob found him and questioned him about the goings-on in Rosewood. Unsatisfied, the mob first ordered him to dig his own grave and then proceeded to take his life. The official death toll of the Rosewood Massacre, which began on January 1st, 1923, through January 7th, 1923, included the 5 to 6 aforementioned Blacks and some 2 to 3 whites. Some sources even say that the cost was much higher, with as many as 20 to 30 Blacks killed. Maholda Brown Carrier, a school teacher in Rosewood, was a survivor of the Rosewood Massacre. She was also the wife of Aaron Carrier, who escaped with his life before the mob burned the community to the ground. A mob went to her house and questioned the whereabouts of her husband during the assault on Fannie Taylor. We know of her story due to the tireless efforts of her niece, Lizzie Robinson Jenkins. With grit and sheer resilience, she, Miss Maholda Brown Carrier, told the men who came to her house, "My husband was with me home all night." Maybe the men didn't like her tone or they were just unsatisfied with her answer, but regardless, They abducted her, and R-A-P-E-D, her. Miss Jenkins said that her aunt said that she never felt clean after that. Maholda changed her name 5 times and moved 10 times. She just never really felt like herself, like so many other survivors who vowed silence for decades of fear of retaliation. The trauma of what had happened was just unbearable. On January 29, 1923, Governor Carey Hardy ordered an investigation. A grand jury declined to issue indictments due to a lack of evidence. No one was ever prosecuted for any of the killings or arsons in the Rosewood Massacre. Now here you have survivors of this senseless event who were literally terrified of speaking, and now the legal system failed to support them and save their families' lives. I mean, ask yourself, can you really blame them for their hush-hush culture? For nearly 60 years, people seldom mentioned the massacre. I mean, unless it was spoken in confidence with close relatives, those, of course, whom were likely to be descendants of the survivors. But they never really received closure. They never rebuilt. However, as my father would say, God always has a ram in the bush. So in 1982, a reporter from the St. Petersburg Times named Gary Moore published an investigation spotlighting the erasure of the predominantly black town, rather than focusing on the alleged crime that incited the massacre to begin with. In 1994, then Governor Lawton Chiles signed House Bill 291, which compensated 8 surviving families with $2.1 million, roughly $150,000 each. A state university fund was also established so the descendants of Rosewood survivors could receive free tuition towards a university in Florida of their choice. In 1997, director John Singleton created a dramatization of the events entitled Rosewood. The film is definitely hard to watch. And as an actress, I mean, I just have to give a standing ovation for the teams who brought the film to life because I know it wasn't easy. Then, after 30 years of work, Lizzie Jenkins persuaded Florida legislature to erect a historical marker at the site of what is left of Rosewood. So in 2004, then Governor Jeb Bush dedicated a plaque alongside the highway, right behind the John Wright House, that preserves the story of the tragedy that caused the fall of the Rosewood community. But you want to know one of the good things to come out of this horror story? The story of Rosewood is only one of countless harrowing tales originating from the Deep South before, during, and after slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect on January 1st, 1865. Out of several hours of research, I just have to say I was honestly inspired by the dedication and retelling of certain events and the acknowledgement of the deceased and the survivors by none other than Miss Lizzie Robinson Jenkins, niece of Aaron and Maholda Carrier. Miss Jenkins said that she was actually angry when her mother told her that she had to keep telling this story. But she was compelled because people are still suffering to this day. The work she's doing is important and it serves a valuable purpose. Miss Jenkins founded the Real Rosewood Foundation, which serves to protect and preserve Rosewood's history. Now, according to an article posted by Main Street Daily News of Gainesville, Rosewood descendants got to tour the John Wright House in 2023, which is the only structure left remaining after the entire community was exonerated during the week-long massacre. The house, sitting on 35 acres, may actually become a museum, which is one of the initiatives Miss Jenkins has spent so much of her life dedicated to doing. On the official website, she states, "Today it is my work and your work to stand up, stand in solidarity, and empower this generation." Ditto, Miss Jenkins. Ditto. If you would like to support Miss Jenkins and the Real Rosewood Foundation's mission, please visit the website at www.rosewoodflorida.com. If you would like to support our channel, please like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with your family and friends. May God bless you and your family without bounds, and I'll talk with you again soon in the next 7 Belle Tale.